Can music tell the story of a city in the sense that music gives a city its identity, its edge? I think it can. In this and several upcoming episodes, we're going to explore the impact of some of Toronto's more iconic live music venues, the bands that played there, and the retail stores and the events that complemented both. We'll talk to the people who were there, people who photo documented the scene, bands that played, and people who operated music retail. In this episode, we're going to talk about music clusters. Look back at just about any decade in Toronto and we'll find establishments where live music was played. Dig really deep into our history, back when this province was a colony named Upper Canada, storied public houses like the Wheat Chief Tavern or the Black Bull occasionally featured a live music entertainer. And this was an added draw for people to come in and enjoy an ale. Music-specific venues were increasingly popular in the 1940s, when the Palace Pier or the C&E Bandshell hosted the likes of Duke Ellington, Peggy Lee, and Count Basie. Fast forward to the 1960s, and venues like the O'Keefe Centre, Friars Tavern, the Hawk's Nest, the Riverboat, and even Varsity Stadium opened this city's doors to live music and legendary artists in a very different way. But the real economic clout of music in Toronto didn't begin fully forming until the late 1970s and early 1980s. The big change occurring around this time was the cluster of music-related businesses that complemented each other and created economic hubs in Toronto. Music main streets began growing, first in the Yonge Street corridor, then Queen Street West. Around this time, older mainstays like the Colonial Tavern were starting to see their decline, and the Colonial eventually closed up in the 1980s. But this was a time of changing tastes, and also a time when the value of having a diversity of musical offerings was starting to make its footprint in the city. We had an explosion of places to hang out, drink, and to listen to bands. When the changing tastes came to the formation of new clusters, and a new economic reality for the industry and for the city. Queen West saw the Horseshoe Tavern, the Rivoli, the Rex, the Cameron House. Its diversity also offered the Bovine Sex Club, the Velvet Underground, and the Bamboo. And what made this explosion unique and full of potential was the Main Street effect. You could shop for records, CDs, T-shirts, buy music magazines and newspapers, or tickets to upcoming events. You could grab a quick bite to eat or sit down for a more formal restaurant. The odd studio here and there was another building block in this infrastructure. In other words, we saw the emergence of a music cluster, and not only in complementary businesses, but in the diversity of music offerings. Queen West was a true cluster. The Yonge Street corridor was another of those magical clusters. The Gasworks, the Masonic Temple, Maple Leaf Gardens, Nuts and Bolts, The Edge, Massey Hall, the Ryerson Theatre, Larry's Hideaway, the Copa. Up and down the corridor, you could see anyone from Led Zeppelin and the Police to XTC, Rush, or INXS. The bigger venues like the Gardens or Massey were typically the turf of those artists who made it, so to speak, and graduated from the club scene. But it wasn't just the number of music venues. It wasn't just the bands that brought people into the area. It was also the fact that you could shop at one of a dozen record stores, check out the many head or souvenir stores that sold T-shirts and posters. Again, it was a cluster, albeit of a different kind. And when economic clusters form, you have a powerful lever for and revenue generation. And not just from the dollars made directly and from the cluster, but from the fact that the city, whichever city it may be, can use this feature to lure international conferences, for example, and other events, because at the end of a conference day, there are things for people to do and places to see and hear some of the best acts, plenty of stores open late, food establishments, and bars. Another reason to visit Toronto. An economic cluster, in its simplest definition, is a dense network of companies or institutions in a specific geographic sphere. If we look at economic clusters from an industrial perspective, We would see a cluster composed of production companies, raw material suppliers, services providers, companies in related fields, and public institutions, such as associations, research centers, training centers, things like universities and schools or reference centers. So it's an entire infrastructure and community, all related by a central activity, whether that's the building of cars in some cities, textile manufacturers in others, or even a military base. Many cities around the globe have economic clusters, but few have music clusters as strong an economic engine. Let's briefly look at some other cities, well known as music cities or cities with music clusters. Nashville is a prime example. Its main entertainment street, Broadway, is Honky Tonk Row. Live music all the time. And despite the image of Nashville as a country music town, you'll hear everything along Broadway. Additionally, there are countless supporting businesses, ranging from souvenir shops and music retail to eateries and local museums. What's more is the fact that Nashville is also a world center for recording studios, production centers, manufacturing companies that make musical instruments, music associations, and broadcast centers that host music awards ceremonies. The universities offer specialized programs that are unique to the area and complement and support the local economy. Halls of fame and specialized reference centers both support the industry and attract tourists. Nashville is a total cluster, so much that local sports teams like the Nashville Predators feature music imagery in their branding. Another city known for its music is Cleveland. The birthplace of rock and roll, so goes the saying and the historical plaque. It was a music play town for any touring band. Plenty of live venues, club size and concert size, and Cleveland is home to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But is Cleveland a music cluster, a music city? While the Hall of Fame is a must-see, Cleveland does not have the community of businesses and institutions that forge a cluster around music. In fact, Cleveland may at this point be more of a sports city than anything else, with much of what is available downtown servicing the teams in baseball, football, or basketball. Music is not Cleveland's champion. So back to Toronto. Are we a city with great live venues and a handful of clustered businesses, or do we genuinely have a music cluster? At best, I think we could say that Toronto had music clusters. And again, this is going back to the late 1970s through to possibly the early 1990s. Since then, there have been dozens of examples of good ideas, but in the wrong place or at the wrong time. So many owners built venues in isolated areas, hoping the crowds would come by virtue of the lineup or the venue itself. It's a challenging proposition at best. You need to be part of something bigger than yourself. Which brings up another aspect of clusters. They don't last unless they're constantly innovating. And most of the owners are hard-working small business people who also want to have a bit of fun with what they do. Constantly keeping up with new technology is tough. Technology made it more and more difficult to attract customers to bricks-and-mortar music stores. Technology made it easier to see music streamed. Businesses change. Event tickets increase dramatically as a result. Rents change. Tastes change. Owners sometimes just want to change for themselves, and so clusters change. Any economic cluster is a magical thing, especially when they form without any sort of central planning or government regulation. But the long-term survival of clusters probably do require some sort of central planning and government cooperation to keep them innovating. Keep them linked to other small, complementary businesses and institutions in their neighborhood, and connected to larger civic outreach by tourism and promotion officials. Which raises a key question. Isn't this a fundamental role of business improvement associations? The next podcasts in this series will continue looking at Toronto as a music city, what we can celebrate from earlier decades, and whether or not things truly can reignite as we move forward into the future. Visit stephenchristiansen.ca for more podcasts. You can also stream this episode through your favorite podcast platform, including Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, and more. I'm Stephen Christiansen. Thanks for listening.